doesn't know that mom let me know anything. She thinks I figured this out on my own. I would not have figured this out on my own, right? So that intelligence allows me to communicate with her better. If I didn't know that and I screw it up again down the road somewhere, now LC starts running commentary in her mind where, well, coach doesn't trust me. Coach doesn't think I'm, one of the better defenders. I don't understand what else I can do to stay on the floor. Like all of a sudden, she's narrating a whole bunch of falsehoods in her mind simply because I didn't know enough to communicate better. I'll give you another example. This is one that John O'Sullivan shared in his book. My last year at Springville, we had one senior on the team, and she was not chosen as a captain. And there are good reasons for that. I understood why that didn't happen. But when she got home that night, after we made the announcement, mom sends me a text, 9 o'clock. I've never seen KG this upset before in her life. She won't come out of her room. She's yelling. I can hear her throwing stuff around. She's like, I'm just letting you know. Now, I knew mom was pissed as well. I know mom well enough to know that she's got a bit of firecracker in her too. And I appreciated her restraint with me. And I just said, I appreciate you giving me the heads up. I'll talk to her. So a couple days later, we go to a jamboree and I just sit down with her on the bus. And I said, hey, KG, how does it feel? Or, just what was the first question? Sit down with her on the bus. And I said, I know it can be hard being a senior that doesn't get chosen as a captain. But I gave her the speech from Miracle. You don't have to have a C on your chest to be a leader. And I talked to her a little bit about, as a senior, you still have influence. And as somebody that's experienced the program for 4 years and has won a state championship, and as somebody that, while your peers, I didn't say it this way, but may not have chosen you to be a leader, you're still respected in the locker room. There are lots of opportunities here for you to have a positive influence on your team. And so we talked a little bit back and forth, and she shared a little bit about how she was frustrated. We fast forward at the end of the year. Mom comes back to me at the state championship celebration, and she says, Coach, the conversation that you had with KG changed the trajectory of her season and the experience she had her senior year. I would not have known about that if I didn't open the door to parents being able to share when something is up. And the reason I would do that, again, goes down here. Why would I open that door? Because parents, if I see them as a resource for information that I don't have, a perspective that I don't have, it can help me to coach and communicate better with those players than I would be able to if I didn't have that connection. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, there are some coaches that will do meetings with every player about playing time. A friend of ours in Minnesota, John Carrier, used to schedule meetings the third week of every season. He would sit down with player and parents and very explicitly articulate their role, where they're at right now in the rotation, the things they do well, and if there's one or two things that they need to work on here in the coming month, this is it. And he did that with all of his varsity players in week 3 and week 4. And his purpose in that was, I want to be as clear as possible about reality, about where players are. So parents are hearing the same thing from me. They're not playing a game of telephone where John says it to the player, and then the player goes home and tells a different story to mom and dad. And then 2 weeks later, when the player's not playing, even though John said this is where you're at, mom and dad are upset because the kid thought that, if he worked a little bit harder, he'd be able to work himself into the lineup. It takes away some of that miscommunication. I know Dawn Staley at South Carolina women's basketball. She will do Zoom sessions with all the parents a couple times a year and say, look, here's where everybody's at. The starting five, the rotation, the kids coming off the bench. Here's everybody's role. And she does it in front of everyone. Now, that might take a little more courage than I'm ready for. I don't know if I want to sit all the parents down and go through, player by player what their role is. But she would tell you, I'm just sick of the bullshit. She's just tired of it. And so she's like, I'm just going right to it. They're going to get absolute transparency and honesty from me. And if they have an issue with it, we can talk about it. But it's harder for them to complain to each other as well when she's laid it out player by player with all the parents present. So the advantage to that would be more clarity in communication about roles and expectations. Now, let me talk a little bit about this here. I think this is a great approach that I stole from a guy named Alex Auerbach, who we just had on the IBCA podcast here, actually the last 2 weeks. And Alex was the mental sports performance coach at the Toronto Raptors when Nick Nurse was there and they won an NBA title. And we were talking a little bit about, how do you coach players that have overbearing adults in their life? And he used this phrase, Nate, I think in those meetings, like when you're having a meeting with a parent, you need to be a scientist, more of a scientist than a defense attorney. And when he said that, I thought, man, that makes a lot of sense. Because most of those meetings that I've been in, as soon as the parent starts complaining or they start laying out, their justification for why their kid should play or they've been mistreated, what have you, I immediately become defensive. Immediately, I think, but wait a minute. You want your kid to be able to shoot contested floaters in the lane, but she only makes 20% of them. Like, I go to the data, I go to the stats, I go to the stuff that we chart because I'm looking to defend my position, not to learn from the conversation. And Alex has really challenged me to be more curious about what I don't understand, about what the parent doesn't understand, about what the player doesn't understand. So when we have these conversations, and quite honestly, serendipity struck this morning. I woke up at 6:08 a.m. and I have a text message from a mom that says, "Do you have time for a conversation today?" So I want to talk a little bit about how that went. So I call her back during the day, 11 o'clock in the morning here, and I had an idea of where this was going to go. But I grounded myself a little bit first before I had this conversation. Like I literally took a couple deep breaths. This is not about you, Nate. This is not about your decisions. This is an opportunity to understand the player a little bit better, understand what she's hearing at home, understand the influences that are shaping the stories that she's telling herself. Listen and listen to learn. So I did. So one of the things in those conversations I've been much better at is I'm listening with an acute ear to the stories that mom is telling herself or that the player is telling mom. And I'm asking myself, are those stories rooted in evidence? Are they grounded in fact? So I'll give you an example. Mom says offhandedly, well, she only played half the game last night, so she had to go to the LBC to get a workout in because she didn't feel like she got enough run. That's a story. And I think to myself, but she played 25 of 32 minutes. So the story is not true. Now, the story still fuels an emotional response that is very valid for the kid and for the mom, but the story's not true. And then she says, it's really hard for my daughter to get shots up because she always has the best defender on her and she's always face guarded. So if she doesn't get help by running some plays for her, she's just not going to get very many shots. And I thought to myself, that's a story. And if that story were true, or that's the story I believed, the emotion that mom was expressing and that daughter was expressing to mom would make perfect sense. The problem is they're not true. So in our game last night, CPU's best defender was not guarding this kid. She was not face guarded a single time in the game. So they're operating from stories that are not grounded in reality. And I'm telling you, that makes our job pretty hard. That makes the communication a little bit different. I'm not trying now to justify my decisions as a coach. Now I'm trying to think about how do we present some evidence and some facts here to maybe, I don't even know if refute is the right word, but to kind of ground our parents and the player in reality here, that this is not the case. And when mom says, well, she's such a good shooter, she's shooting 70% from three her last 4 games. I don't know why you're not telling her to shoot more. So I go back and look at the numbers. She's taken more shots than every player on our team except for one. And she's only 2 shots behind. So it's not like she's not getting shots, right? So at any rate, there's not necessarily anything that I can do in this conversation to change the stories that they're telling themselves. But it definitely helps me understand the player a lot better because I'm looking for them. I'm listening for them. I'm asking questions to try to surface what is she telling herself? What is mom telling her? Because that's what I'm really up against in this situation. Now, here's the other thing I did in this conversation. Mom's complaining about playing time and not running enough sets and not getting enough shots, and her daughter's open and they don't pass her the ball, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not going to get into a basketball conversation with mom. And I made that clear at the parent meeting, which I'll talk about in a second here, that one of the boundaries is I'm not going to talk basketball strategy with parents. We have almost 100 years of basketball coaching experience on our staff. We've got a good chance to figure it out on our own. I'm not interested in a parent's 7th grade press break that worked for them back in the day. And usually parents kind of chuckle at that, but you'd be surprised how many they still want to come up and say, oh man, can you believe this 2-3 zone thing? I'm just not sure about it, and I'm just not going to engage. So when mom goes through all of her basketball checkpoints here, my response was this, and I think this is a really powerful question for coaches. I said to the mom, let's assume for a minute the basketball doesn't change. So we're going to keep doing what we're doing. We're not running any more sets for your kid. We're going to rotate the same way. How can we as coaches better communicate with your kid? What can we do so that she feels more support from us? And you know what mom's response was? I don't know. And then she went on to some more complaints about how her kid, wasn't getting what she thought she deserved. And I let her punch herself out. And then I said in a different way, I appreciate you sharing that. And I guess this is where I'm coming from. I'm not communicating those messages to her intentionally. In fact, I don't remember saying half of the things that you're telling me here. So clearly there's a communication breakdown that might be my fault. And I'm just looking for ways, what can I do better or differently to communicate better with your kid? And your response was, I don't know. I asked this question 4 different times at 4 different points in the conversation. And I think by the end, mom realized like maybe this isn't as easy as what she thinks it is because she didn't have any advice. The person that knows her kid better than anybody could not give me an actionable step on something I could do better. I think that's a powerful question to keep the focus on the kid's experience rather than get hung up in the coach's decisions about different things that are affecting that kid's role in the team, etc. Here's one more asterisk for this, and then I'm going to breeze through some practical stuff. I also very much believe that your AD should never ever be surprised by a parent phone call or email or text message or an offhanded conversation, in the stands. If you have a conversation that you think in some way could have a negative effect on your team or on your position as a coach, you want to get to the AD first and frame the parents before the parent frames you. And what I mean by that is, if I go to the parent, I remember this quick story here, but we had a parent one time that I went and watched an AAU game with the parents and watched her kid, and we had a few kids playing at this tournament. We come up afterwards, and mom says, she wasn't feeling very well today. She didn't have her best game, but I think she scored 7 points. And looked at dad. She scored 7 points, right? And I'm looking at him wide-eyed.